Stephen returned to his apartment early in the morning. He hadn't been home for a year and a half, a huge period of time that changed his whole life. Stephen worked as a captain of long-distance navigation on a ship, a romantic profession he had dreamed of since childhood. No one could have imagined that the young boy from the orphanage would be able to realize his dream. But he did. He served in the army, joined the merchant navy, received a higher education, and sailed all the seas within and outside the country. But the oceans and seas became his elements. In the breaks between voyages, Stephen fulfilled another dream. He bought a luxurious apartment in the city center and a car. He also had a decent bank account. However, love was missing. And then one day, he saw her, thin, fragile, and defenseless. She was crying in a restaurant, left there by some scoundrel who drank, ate, showered her with compliments, and then ran away, leaving her with a huge bill. Stephen paid for everything and took her home. The Tamari told him about herself. She was finishing a pedagogical college, living in a dormitory, and was also an orphan. Stephen looked at her and realized that she was his dream. He also bribed him that she was also from the orphanage. That's how two lonely hearts met, and it didn't matter that she was almost 15 years younger than him. He wouldn't let her go. Stephen began to court her beautifully, and Valerie responded with reciprocity. They got married a year later, and Stephen was in seventh heaven with happiness. There were few guests at the wedding, only a few colleagues from Stephen's work and one of Valerie's friends. Stephen was a little sad that there would be no relatives on either his or the bride's side at the wedding. His parents died in a car accident when he was only a year old, and no other relatives were found. That's how he grew up in an orphanage. Valerie told him that she was abandoned on the doorstep of an orphanage when she was a newborn, and her negligent mother was never found. Well, okay, but now they are together forever, and they will have a strong family. Valerie loved him and tried to be a good housewife. Not everything worked out for her, but Stephen just smiled. It's not so critical that she oversorted the soup or burnt his shirt. The main thing was that all his troubles were now over. His troubles retreated next to her. The only thing that upset him were his long trips. Valerie was also worried but eventually got used to it. Then the fateful voyage happened. Stephen's ship was captured by pirates. It is the 21st century, but pirates are still there. The cargo was looted and the crew was captured. It was good that at least everyone was left alive. But then the real hell began. Stephen and his crew were held in some basement, barely fed. That's where the pirates were demanding a ransom, but no one at home was eager to save the sailors. The guys realized this over time by watching how the bandits behaved. They were in mortal danger, but they managed to escape through unimaginable routes. Perhaps someone above them didn't abandon them, or the sea god protected them. They made it to the embassy first, and then home altogether. Stephen had been unable to get to his hometown for about a month, due to issues with management, the cargo owner, and other things that happened. But now everything was settled. The sailors rushed to their families, and Stephen did the same. Of course, he had already called Valerie several times before this, once when he was only in the embassy, and then again. She was pleased to hear his voice and she burst into tears. She said she was really looking forward to seeing him. However, in the last week, she had gone silent and wasn't answering his calls. Stephen headed home with a sense of alarm. He opened the door to his apartment with his key, which he had luckily not lost during his adventures, because it had fallen into the lining of his coat. Getting into the apartment, Stephen discovered that Valerie wasn't there. The man was unpleasantly surprised. It was still so early. Where could she be? He looked closer and realized that she hadn't been there for several days. Although Valerie wasn't the perfect housekeeper, she would have definitely washed the cup, but it was already covered in mold in the sink with the remnants of tea, and it was dusty somehow. Stephen dialed Valerie's number, but it was unavailable. He was seriously worried and started calling his friends, but they didn't know anything either. Neither did the neighbors. Stefan turned to the police and learned the terrible truth there. It turned out that a week ago, Valerie died in a car accident on the countryside. Stephen couldn't understand why his wife had gone out of town. What had happened? He wondered, why wasn't I informed of my wife's death? He resentfully asked the police.
Oh, we were going to...
Mother? What nonsense. Stephen was angry. My wife came from an orphanage, he thought. But you're mistaken. She definitely had a mother, and she is a decent elderly lady at that. Stephen decided to deal with this issue later and only learned where Valerie was buried. It turned out to be in the same village where she had died. He immediately went to the rural cemetery. It wasn't difficult to find his wife's grave, a fresh mound covered with wreaths and recently wilted fresh flowers. Invitation, and next to the cross were photos of Valerie. So young and beautiful in the photo, she smiled with such a radiant smile. It was hard to believe that she was no more. Such beauty shouldn't fade prematurely. Forgive me, my girl, Stephen whispered and knelt at the grave. Forgive me. I longed for you so much. I went through so much and dreamed of hugging you, but I didn't make it. My sunshine, what happened to you? Why are you even here, my dear? He whispered something else, and didn't immediately notice an old woman approaching the grave, holding a baby who was about 6 months old. A woman sat at the other end of the grave watching Stephen. But with one hand she removed dry flowers, and with the other she held a child. Stephen, seeing the woman, froze at sick impudence. It was clear that he wanted to be alone. Couldn't she wait? And what was she doing here anyway? We get out of here, he suddenly said sharply. What are you doing here? I'll clean up my wife's grave myself. Are you her husband? That the elderly woman got up and looked at Stephen inquisitively. So why didn't you come earlier, husband? I was on a business trip, and why should I answer to you? I said go away. But I'm Valerie's mother, the woman said. Mother? Stephen was confused. But how? Valerie said she was from an orphanage. You're lying. Why would I lie? Atorides, the woman sighed. Valerie was ashamed of me, and I would give anything to be lying there now instead of her. But God decided otherwise. Apparently, he decided that I should live longer and raise Valerie's son. Whose son? Stephen exclaimed. Actions. Lady, are you crazy? Valerie never told me about any child. Well, it's clear why she didn't tell you. The woman replied. My grandson was born with a serious illness. Anyway, forgive me. I attacked you for no reason and I said too much, probably for nothing. I'll go. I just wanted to clear the grave. I'm ashamed that there is disorder here. She turned and walked toward the exit, and Stephen stood stunned, looking back and forth between Valerie's photo and the old woman with the baby. Wait, he shouted, running after her, grabbing her shoulder and turning her toward him. But the woman hesitated, shook her head, and then said, "Let's go to my house where we can talk. You'll understand everything then and decide what to do." "Let's drive there," Stephen offered. The elderly woman nodded in agreement, and Stephen helped her and the baby settle into the back seat. He briefly glanced at the baby's face. Could the elderly woman be telling the truth, he wondered? Was this his son? But why hadn't Valerie told him she was pregnant? He drove quietly down the village street, his mind spinning with questions. He felt like it was all happening to someone else. "Stop here." The woman touched his shoulder and pointed to a shabby house. Stephen looked at the house doubtfully. How could anyone live in it, he thought. It's an old and cracked house. The rain could certainly flood in.
Yes, it's not a palace. I had to move in here when my house burned down. It was old too, but sturdy. But then a short circuit occurred and I was lucky to get out alive. The village council gave me this housing and said I had to fix it up myself.
But where can I get the money? Mrs. Harper replied, her voice full of sadness. My pension is a minimum. Stephen suspiciously looked at the elderly woman. Was she trying to scam him for money? He wondered. Maybe that's why she brought a child to set up Valerie. But despite his suspicions, the man decided to listen to Mrs. Harper. Counting inside the house, everything was poor, although clean. Thanks to the neighbors at Pew Mapers, Mrs. Harper said, they didn't leave us in trouble. After the fire, they brought clothes and furniture, and when I took Sam, they shared children's things. Attain, now that I am receiving benefits for Sam, things are easier. Stop, Stephen said sharply. I want to understand what you were saying about Valerie. He looked at Mrs. Harper, his gaze unwavering. I think you're all lying, he said.
Why would I?
Wait, Stephen said. Let me put my grandson to bed and we'll talk. He went to the next room with the child and Mrs. Harper sat on the creaky stool in the kitchen, patiently waiting for the host to return. Soon he came back without the child and sat across from her. Now he said, Tell me everything. She opened the thick album and began to speak. Here's the only thing that survived after the fire in my house. When she graduated, she immediately told Mrs. Harper to find the money for college, and Mrs. Harper didn't mind. She even went to the bank for a loan, but she was denied the loan because her income was too small. Why is that?
Ollie cried.
Look, Egan got into law school, and her father has already paid a year in advance. Becky's parents helped her. They'll be studying at universities. And what's wrong with me? I was better in school than they were.
Don't worry so much, my dear, you'll get in. Mrs. Harper comforted her. Don't compare yourself to Becky and Megan.
One has a farmer for a father, the other has a chairman of the village council. Their incomes are incomparable to mine.
Don't worry, you'll get into another school, and you can find a part-time job. And this year, we'll try to save as much as we can.
Orzahnor in the neighboring district. Valerie screamed, only idiots go there.
I want to live in the city, but it's not working yet, my dear. It's not working for you, but it will for me. I'm leaving tomorrow. So, how will you live? Mrs. Harper got up, but Valerie was unstoppable. In the morning, she rushed by bus to the district center, while Mrs. Harper ran to the canteen to make... Mrs. Harper tried to find Valerie, but to no avail. And then in the winter, Becky, Valerie's former classmate, came and said that she had seen her friend with a man coming out of an expensive restaurant. She saw Valerie that very evening. Her daughter was in an expensive fur coat, and a man twice her age was next to her. Mrs. Harper rushed to hug Valerie, but she recoiled. "Have you lost your mind? I don't know you," her daughter said, passing by. She went into the restaurant with her companion, and the guards didn't let Mrs. Harper in. Came from their conversation, she realized that Valerie was meeting rich men for money. "Oh," she cried bitterly when she went to the station, and then she cried all the way. She'd lost her daughter, and in the spring, Valerie returned home. She apologized, swore to take responsibility. At Sarcomprete only in the summer did she run away again, taking Mrs. Harper's small savings. She left a note. "Sorry, but I can't live in the village. I'll attend college in the city." And she did attend and study, but she hardly communicated with her mother. Mrs. Harper knew her daughter lived in a dormitory, but still hardly communicated with her mother. Mrs. Harper knew her daughter lived in a dormitory, but still hung out with wealthy men. And Valerie didn't want to see her, saying the poor mother just shames her. Then Mrs. Harper learned that Valerie had gotten married. She was thrilled that her husband was an honorable man, a sailor. Becky told her, who spoke with Valerie, that her mother, Mrs. Harper, thought her daughter would finally settle down and waited for Valerie to realize how badly she treated her. But time passed and nothing changed. Last year, Mrs. Harper dared to go to the city herself. She learned her daughter's address from Becky, and after her house burned down, she thought her daughter would take her in. She saw Valerie at the entrance, and her heart warmed up, thinking that Valerie was her blood. At that time, Valerie was already 7 months pregnant. Valerie came up to her, hissing, "What are you doing here?" But Mrs. Harper didn't notice this malice and congratulated her daughter that she would soon become a mother. Valerie screamed, "I'm not happy at all. I already hate this child. I would get rid of it if I could, but I can't." Mrs. Harper went pale. "The child is happiness," she said. Larry laughed hysterically. "He'll be born with Down's disease. Do you know how happy that is?" she said. "I hate him," she said. "Sweetie, calm down," Mrs. Harper said. "But nowadays they do a lot with such children. They are almost normal." Her mother tried to calm her down. As Valerie asked, "What does your husband say?" Mrs. Harper replied, "He's good. I heard from Becky." And always, Becky talks nonsense. Valerie smirked. "It's good. She didn't see me pregnant, or everyone would know by now," she said. Valerie added, "My husband doesn't say anything, because he's on a trip and he doesn't know about the baby." "I haven't told him yet," Valerie said, "but how about later? Later, when the baby is born, I'll give him up." I don't need a fool, she said.
Mrs. Harper asked, "How will you refuse?"
Your husband will find out anyway. Excessive neighbors will say.
She added, "Here, neighbors are not like in the village. No one talks to anyone and doesn't interfere with one's business. But with
Valerie hissed, "Don't you dare tell anyone you saw me pregnant," leaving without inviting her mother into the apartment.
Mrs. Harper felt bad. She couldn't believe she had raised such a cruel daughter. She wondered, how did this happen? Mrs. Harper thought, apparently Valerie inherited the wayward genes from her father. Mrs. Harper didn't leave the city. She started working nearby at her daughter's house as a janitor and was given a room in the basement. She saw Valerie being taken to the maternity hospital, and 3 days later, her daughter was already home without her belly and baby. Mrs. Harper tried to speak with her, but Valerie wouldn't listen.
And then she blurted out that the baby had died. Mrs. Harper rushed to the hospital to pick up her grandson, intending to give him a proper burial. But to her surprise, he was alive and lying in the ward for ill patients. That's when Mrs. Harper realized what she had to do. She went to the village to get the necessary documents and ran around various government institutions in the city. Initially, they didn't want to give the child to her, but eventually, they relented. After all, Mrs. Harper was still his blood relative. In short, she took her grandson from the hospital and settled with him in an old house in the village. She didn't tell Valerie anything, letting her believe that the child was in an orphanage. She and Sam would live together. For his grandmother, he was a good boy. He was just a little different. And recently, Valerie discovered where a child was. For the first time in many years, she called her mother. She scolded and shouted that Mrs. Harper had no right to make decisions about the baby's fate. But then she cried and admitted that she couldn't forget him, his tiny hands and fluffy neck. He appeared in her dreams at night. Mrs. Harper realized that she had come to terms with what she had done. "Come to us, daughter," she said, "and you will see your son. You will take him in your arms and love him immediately, and your husband will accept him. Don't doubt it." And Valerie went to her mother and son, but tragically, she never made it. She was in an accident. Mrs. Harper buried her daughter and struggled to cope, but her grandson Sam helped her not to lose her mind. On one particular day, she felt drawn to her daughter's grave and took her grandson with her. There she saw a tall, strong man, whom she immediately recognized as Valerie's husband. Mrs. Harper decided not to hide anything and told him the truth. The truth was rarely sweet, and this one was worse than poison, but he had the right to know everything. Stephen listened to Mrs. Harper and just nodded his head. He didn't know so much about his wife. He couldn't believe it. Henry couldn't do that to her mother, to him, to their child. "I need to think about everything," he said quietly to Mrs. Harper, left, peeking into the baby's room before he did. The child had already woken up and was lying quietly in the crib. It was unclear who he looked like, because he had the specific features characteristic of his illness. Stephen left with the thought pounding in his head. What to do? First, he decided to ask the neighbors if Valerie had been pregnant. They hesitatingly nodded in response. It seemed so. Then Stephen went to the maternity hospital. the Tomations, everyone confirmed that Valerie had given birth to a child with Down syndrome and that she had refused him. The grandmother had taken temporary custody. The father had been away for a long time. Besides, Stephen figured out that Sam had been conceived 3 months before his last sale. There was no doubt that Stephen was the father, so now he had to decide. A couple of days later, Stephen's car stopped at an old house. Mrs. Harper was in the yard with her grandson. "I'm here for my son," Stephen said to her. Mrs. Harper turned pale and hugged the child to her chest.
And you, Stephen, Mrs. Harper said, I'm often away from home for long periods. Who will look after my grandson if not his own grandmother?
Mrs. Harper sighed with relief. And before leaving, they stopped by the cemetery. Stephen whispered, "Sleep well, dear," while stroking the cross. "I forgive you for everything. You were just confused, my little silly girl." He then reassured Sam. "Don't worry, Sam will know that he had the best mom." Together, they left for the city. But over time, Stephen started going to the sea again. Mrs. Harper took care of Sam. The child grew up and developed as far as his abilities allowed. A good tutor, Sydney, started working with him. Once she met Stephen, he had just returned from a trip and took his son to her himself. They liked each other, though at first they carefully hid it. But true feelings cannot be hidden forever. After a while, Sydney became Stephen's wife. She found a common language with Mrs. Harper. And little Sam understood the main thing. He had a mom,